morning and welcome to the first of the Chem Safety 2022 webinars. I'm Janet Connochie, a Senior Consultant and Compliance Certifier with Chem Safety, and this month I'll be having a look at the recent changes to the hazardous substance regulations. Questions are welcome throughout the session. Please use the question and answer dialogue in Zoom, and I'll answer these at the end of the presentation. The session is being recorded, and so a link to this will be sent out in the follow-up email, along with details of our upcoming webinars. All our previous webinars are available on YouTube. So just before Christmas last year, or late last year, the Hazardous Substance Amendment regulations were released, and these came into force at the start of January, on the 5th of January this year. As you can see, there's rather a lot of them there. So we're going to go through these today and figure out exactly what they all mean for us. The good news is that the online version of the hazardous substance regulations at legislation.gov.nz has been updated. So the version, if you look at the version, it will say version as at the 5th of January 2022. So all of these amendments will show in the regulations if you go to look at them. If you're not familiar with looking at the regulations online, there is a versions and amendments tab there. And as you can see, the latest version is the as at the 5th of January 2022. If for any reason you're wanting to see what the previous versions look like, you can go and have a look at the different series before the amendments have been added. And we can also see at the bottom of that screen a link there to the amendment regulations and the other changes that have been incorporated over time to the regulations. The amendments have been billed and were consulted on as minor amendments to the hazardous substance regulations. It's about fixing things here and there that weren't working as intended. And they can be categorized in the following ways. So there's minor corrections, including fixing typos and clarifications. There's fixing some errors that existed in the regulations. So there were some things in there that were wrong. There are some updated standards, and then there's been some what I've called significant clarifications and significant changes. And so we're looking at all of these today in some detail or another. So starting off with the minor corrections and clarifications. There's a wee group of things that's all about helping the regulations make more sense. So a number of definitions have been relocated right to the front of the regulation. So Regulation 3 is the interpretation section, and that's where you go to look for all the definitions. Now, some definitions were scattered down in different parts of the legislation. So some of these have been moved up to the front, which is where you'd go to look for them. There's been a wee bit of rewording around some of the secondary containment regulations, and that's just been about putting all the exclusions together. So in a couple of them, it said at the front that this applies to pooling substances over the threshold, but not to ports, and then later down a whole lot of other things. So it's put all those exclusions together in one place, so you're not looking in different parts of a set of information for different things. There's been some changes for editorial consistency. So while there's a chance to make changes, I've done them. My most favourite one is the removal of the hyphen from paint mixing room. But it's not the purpose of these regulations, but they can make those changes and fix typos and things while they're there. And making clearer about the references in part 16, that's for tank wagons, that when they're talking about liquids and gases, they're talking about hazardous substance that are a liquid or a gas. So really basic, straightforward, don't really have any significance to what you do. There's been some clarifications around some things. So they've put in the ability for, I'll call it renewal of a certified handler certificate, but that's around the date that the certificate is being issued can be different from the date the certificate comes into force. So this is just aligning with the practice that you have with location compliance certificates. And it means that if you are going to get a renewed certified handler certificate, you can have those dates align up so it comes up for renewal each time and you're not losing a period of time with that renewal. There was some inconsistent use of retail shop and retail store in the regulations. So the definitions related to retail shops and the regulations were referring to retail stores. And stores gets confused with whether it's an actual store where you are storing things or a store as in a shop. So that's been clarified, and no distinctions now made for retailers of agricultural chemicals. So it's just all about retail shops. And they also clarified that for class 6 packaged substances, if you're looking at separation distances, it said if it was a class 6 and a class 3 substance, you'd look at the class 3 separation distance, but class 3.1D don't have them for protected places when you're looking at packages. So just clarifying that around the separation distances you need to apply there. There have been a few areas where the heading or the title of the regulation has wording in it that's not consistent with what's in the body. So we've got the body text now matches up here. So in this example, they've made it clear that in the body of the regulation, we're looking at pooling substances. So the green is the previous regulation, the blue is the amended one, and a similar sort of thing that we're looking at packaged substances. The title always said package, but it didn't say that in the body. So it's making that nice and clear and consistent throughout the regulation. Few more clarifications and additional bits and pieces around tanks in particular. So an extra standard has been added in around the installation, seismic and wind loading for tanks. There's some information or a change in the requirements for anti-siphoning devices for diesel engines for fire protection purposes. They've added in an additional means of compliance for the location of service tanks in buildings. So this particularly relates to diesel generators, and that those service tanks no longer need to be on the lowest level of the building. So there's a number of particularly large buildings where the generator might be located on the roof that wasn't working with the way the regulations were written. They've clarified that in Part 17, your stationary container certificates, stationary container systems, that the records that you have relating to those, you need to have records that demonstrate your compliance with all of Part 17. There was just a bit of a muck-up with the wording around that. And in Schedule 17, so this is Schedule 25, there's a lot of tables around requirements for stationary containers, and it was inconsistent how they were recording those quantities. So some were in thousands of litres, some were in kilolitres, some were in litres, and one that was supposed to be in kilolitres just had litres. So it was saying that if your stationary tank's got more than 7.5 litres in it, they've made that all consistent with litres in place. There's been some clarification around hydrant systems for LPG. So in the section of the regulations that looks at fire extinguishers, for LPG, your fire extinguisher can be substituted with a hydrant system. And in the previous regulation, it said it just had to have a 20mm diameter hose. A lot of fire hose have a standard internal diameter of 19mm, and so it wasn't clear the way it was written whether that was compliant or not. So they've amended that regulation to give us information about the hydrant system or the hose reel, the length required, and given us specific information that we can quantify about the flow rate or the nominal bore. So we're looking at the internal diameter of the hose. And from what I've been able to see, a typical fire hose with a 19mm diameter will have a flow rate, they give it in litres per minute, so 27 litres per minute, that's about 0.45 litres per second. So that will comply with the flow rate as well as the bore there. And many sprinkler systems will also likely comply. We sometimes see those in LPG cylinder cages, but there's many parameters associated with those. So you do need to get some detail about them. There's been a wee bit of tidying up around the incompatible substances for toxic substances. So previously the regulation, the schedule looked at incompatible substances and materials, and this is clarified that it's just substances that are looking at, and they've taken the opportunity to put some nice brackets around our acids and alkalis and cyanides and things there. And this is getting probably into the very, very geeky side of things, which is what I love. But if you had by chance downloaded or printed a copy of the amendments when they came out, be aware that there has been one correction to an error in the amendments. But if you're just looking at the regulations online, they've all been updated. But if you were going through line by line and you're really desperate to find out what that correction was, just drop me a line, but I won't add to the confusion around that when it's been fixed already. So that's the sort of first section on clarifications. Next, I'm going to have a look at some of the errors that have been corrected. So when we're looking at the errors, there are often things that people have identified and adapted and been working around in practice, and now they've been fixed in the regulations. So there were a number of cross-references or references in the regulations that were incorrect. So they've just corrected those, so that's talking to the right part now. There was an incorrect exclusion of flammable liquids in the provision relating to retail shops, and in particular those smaller quantities of retail shops. So that's been fixed. There was a correction around the static load requirements, and that was, I think, a difference between must not exceed or must be more than, a correction around that. And in Schedule 8 and Table 1, so this is relating to explosives, but there were a whole lot of key items that were missing from that bottom of the table to tell you what some of the information in the table meant. So those have been corrected. There have been some minor corrections or changes. So there are things that are perhaps new or changed that have a bit more of an effect. I've got a couple of them here. Oh, these are what they are. So for explosives that require a controlled substance license, another item, another UN number has been added to that. So it's relating to pyrotechnics for technical purposes have been added to those ones that need a controlled substance license. And in part 15 around gas cylinders designed, they've changed the process for applying to alter the design of a gas cylinder. And in practice, this is making it easier for importers of low pressure fire extinguishers. You don't need to provide as much information when applying for importation of those. There's been corrections made to the separation distances in Schedule 17. So these are the separation distances for packaged Class 6 substances from protected and public places. And the distances that were in place for Class 6.1C were previously just a duplication of the Class 6.1B ones. So those have been corrected now. So in the example showing on screen, the new distances are in the blue there, so you can see there's a reduction in those separation distances for Class 6.1C. The particular figures there are for stores where packages are opened, and it's a separation distance to protected places. So there's 4 tables, protected and public places, open and closed packages in stores. So those have all been fixed. And also in this sort of minor clarification section is a wee bit around organic peroxides. So this is, it's fixing an error that had occurred when the regulations came into force in 2017. So it relates to the section that is being referred to here. So this regulation, it's called Requirements for Securing Class 5.2 Substances. In practice, it's more about the location or the store type. And what we are looking at, it very clearly says it's for the purposes of Regulation 1243B. So this is for location compliance certification. The amended regulation is referring to Sections 2 and Sections 4 of the Australian Standard for the Storage and Handling of Organic Peroxides. Section 2 in that standard talks about minor storage, and it gives a definition of what minor storage is for type C, D, E and F organic peroxides, and there's some thresholds there for container size and total quantity. In practice, we're only looking at Class 5.2 C and D for this regulation, and the location certification threshold for those is 25 kilograms. So the inclusion of minor storage is a bit of a red herring there. So what Section 4 of the standard talks about includes information about the types of package stores. So we're looking at construction requirements for containers or the store that you're keeping your organic peroxides in, and the options there are around the indoor storage cabinets, whether it's a storeroom or compartment, either standalone or in part of a building, inside or part of a building, or a standalone store. And so those are where you need to secure those higher hazard organic peroxides. While we're talking about standards, when standards are referenced in regulation, there will always be reference to a particular year version of the standard. That's important because standards change, and it might change to something that the regulations didn't intend. But it does mean that we end up with a bit of a mismatch as to what the current standards are and what the standards that are being referenced to in the legislation are. So the amendments have taken the opportunity to update one of the standards. In particular, it's AS 1940, the storage and handling of flammable liquids. So it's a very common standard that people use. This has been, the reference in the regulation has been updated from the 2004 to the 2017 version, which is the current version. So AS 1940 is referenced in a few parts of the regulations. So it's referenced in 1.9 about ethanol dilutions, which I'm going to talk about later this morning. In part 11 around flammable liquids cabinets. And this has a wee bit of a substantive change in relation to the hazardous areas for flammable liquids cabinets. The way the regulation was worded when it referred to the 2004 standard is that if you had a flammable liquids cabinet, then the hazardous area that you needed to manage must be the 3 metre and the 1 metre one. The update to the 2017 version now means that the hazardous area can be determined in accordance with the full requirements of 60079.10.1, the classification of hazardous areas. And then there's also quite a number of references to AS 1940 in the stationary container system part of the regulations, part 17. And I haven't been through to verify the two versions to see if there's any difference between the 2004 and 2017 clauses for these particular things. So it is something that people just need to be aware of if they are relying on AS 1940 for these particular bits relating to their tanks. Going to move now on to some of the more significant clarifications. So the changes that might actually have an impact on the way that you manage your hazardous substances on site. So the first one is around workrooms. So this is for flammable liquids, and if you're using them, if the containers are open, then they need to be in a workroom of a particular type, and those are defined. So the change that's been made, and it's quite a spot the difference change in the regulations there. So I've highlighted in orange what's changed. What this means is that they've separated out paint mixing rooms from the type 1, 2 or 3 workrooms. So for type 1 workrooms, the previous limit of having no containers greater than 20 litres no longer exists. That's been removed. And the limit for the quantity of flammable liquids that you can have in a paint mixing room is now an ore. So it can have class 3 substances in containers that are not more than 20 litres, does not hold those that are more than 20 litres, or not more than 450 litres in aggregate quantity. So that's an ore. But just keep in mind that you do need to make sure that your paint mixing room complies with AS/NZS 4114.1. And so if you do have a paint mixing room and your compliance certifiers come to certify it, they will want evidence that that paint mixing room complies with the standard. That should be easy because the standard requires that paint mixing rooms are marked to show that they meet the standard. But we do find some that don't quite have all that documentation there. So the other side of this change in relation to type 1 workrooms, these are 1 hour rated workrooms, is that the maximum quantity that's permitted in these is now aligned with the type 2 or 3. So instead of previously where you couldn't hold more than 450 litres, you can now go up to 7,500 litres or 10,000 litres if it's just 3.1C. The separation distances associated with these larger quantities were already in the regulations, so there's no amendment required for that. The separation distances for those increased quantities are already in place, so that if you do have a type 1 workroom that you think, great, I can now have 500 litres or 1,000 litres or 4,000 litres in, there will be an increased separation distance from protected places for those workrooms. So make sure that that's something that's going to work on your site. I mentioned earlier about ethanol dilutions and alcohol. So there's been a significant clarification around the requirements for alcoholic beverages. So these are ethanol-water dilutions intended for drinking, alcohol, booze, all those interesting things. So previously there were 2 regulations that related to this. It was 1.9 and 8.7. These have been combined into one, so that now if you are thinking about ethanol dilutions, you can just go to one place. It's not hiding in 2. The first part relates to quantities and strengths of alcohol to which these regulations do not apply at all. So if there is alcohol for drinking in containers 5 litres or smaller, then the regulations do not apply. It doesn't matter what that strength of alcohol is. If it's in a small container, the hazardous substance regulations do not apply to it. And also, if the alcohol content is not more than 15% by volume, it doesn't matter how much you've got. If it's not more than 15%, then the hazardous substance regulations do not apply to it. So if you've got those categories of alcoholic beverages, then the hazardous substance regulations don't apply. If you have got strong alcohol in larger containers, we've always had a choice, and what these choices means has been clarified. So I'll just pop back a slide. One of the things that's changed is an increase in the parts that do not apply to these. And I'll talk about that. There's also been the changes related to this regulation around AS 1940 and the move from the 2004 to the 2017 standard. So if you do have an operation that's got bulk quantities of spirits, for example, then you've got a choice in how you comply. You can either comply with a set of criteria in Regulation 1.9, otherwise you must comply with all of the usual regulations. So what Regulation 1.9 covers needs to be at premises that are for storing, handling and processing alcohol. The containers that you use for them must be constructed to Part F4 of AS 1940 in relation to the materials, design, installation, venting and level indication on those. And just so you're aware, that standard does allow wooden containers. So particularly if you're looking at aging alcohols in wine barrels, for example, then there are provisions around the use of wooden containers here. You must also have fire protection that complies fully with Part F8 of AS 1940. And that's quite a detailed section that refers out to other parts of the standard. But so there's fire protection requirements there, and then there's also vapor detection requirements. So if you do choose to go down that path of looking at Regulation 1.9, then you don't need to do these things in orange. If you can't do all of 1.9, so perhaps if you don't want to do the fire protection or the vapor detections but much, then you'd need to do all of these things here in orange. So these include the bits in Regulation 8 around location compliance certification. So 1.9, don't need location compliance certification, otherwise you do. You need to comply with all the items in Part 10 around flammable liquids, including hazardous areas and incompatible substances and those sorts of things. Bunding, secondary containment, all those are there. There's part 11. This is the regulation that talks about your location types and your separation distances. So your type ABCD stores, your type 1, 2, 3 workrooms, if you've got things being processed there, and your separation distances from protected and public places. And then the other part that's been excluded, and that's part of the amendments, is part 17. So the requirements for stationary containers. In either case, you still need to comply with the remainder of the regulations, including the signage and emergency management. So there's a lot of detail here, and I want to sort of make it clear that it's not an exemption or an exclusion, but they are two alternative paths of compliance for dealing with potable alcohol. And just what's going to work for different situations will certainly be quite a cost-benefit analysis required for people in that industry. It's much clearer to understand now. There have been some clarifications around LPG, and in particular, looking at separation distances for different ages of tanks. So if you've got installations of LPG cylinders or LPG tanks, a new installation, any installation, should comply with the normal regulations. So for cylinders, that's 11.6 and 1120, and the distances in Schedule 12, Table 2. If it's tanks, then we've got those regulations there, and Schedule 12, Table 4 apply to LPG tanks. There is a new regulation in Schedule 1 that covers tanks that were installed before September 2010. So in September 2010, the approval and the controls on LPG were reassessed, and this resulted in some changes to the separation distances required for LPG tanks. And that meant that some tanks that were previously compliant no longer complied. So this new clause makes clear that the applicable distances for tanks that were installed before September 2010 are the distances that existed before 2010. So it's just grandfathering in those clauses and those tanks and those separation distances. There's another group of cylinders and tanks, and these are ones that had a DG license, so they were approved before HASNO came in April 2004, and this has been clarified as well. But this allows a reduction in distance of up to 50%, and it's based on those pre-assessment distances if there's an intervening wall. And I'll have a look at some examples about what that wall means. So there's been a change in this clause as well around the requirements for that wall. And there's been a similar amendment put in that covers cylinder filling stations, so LPG cylinder filling stations that were approved before HASNO came in 2004. And provided that there's less than 1,000 kilograms of LPG in cylinders stored at the filling station, then the separation distance to protected or public places can be reduced by up to 50% if there's an intervening wall. So we'll look at some examples. I've got here a 5,000 litre water capacity tank, and the little purple thing sitting out the side is an operable fitting, just to illustrate a point that comes up later on. The required separation distance for this tank is 5 metres from public places and 8 metres from protected places, which are illustrated with those coloured circles there. And if there's nothing in that space is entirely on your site, then make sure we've got that identified on the site plan and that tank's all good to go. If we now look at the situation where we've got a property boundary cutting across where those separation distances go. So I've got the orange line is a property boundary, and on the other side of the boundary is a public place. There are no protected places on that property. In order to comply with the provisions in the regulation to help these tanks come compliant, we need to make sure we've confirmed that the tank was installed before 2004 and it was compliant with the Dangerous Goods Act. I'm not sure how many sites still have copies of their dangerous goods licenses from 18 years ago, but you should have records that show when the tank was installed. There should be plans around that. The distance between the public place and the tank still has to be at least 50% of the required distance. So in this case, that's 2.5 metres, and that's shown by that dotted green line there. The wall, the intervening wall that's in place, must be made of fire-resisting materials. It must be vapor tight, and it must be the right height. So that's at least 1.8 metres tall, or 0.6 metres above the top surface of the tank or the fill point on the tank. And then the distance around the wall from the tank must be at least that required 5 metre distance. And so if that wall's been built there to cover that distance, then that's going to comply. In the next scenario, the same installation, but now we have a protected place that's present on site closer than the required separation distance. So we need to verify again that the tank was in place before 2004 and compliant. That the distance between the tank and the protected place is at least 4 metres, at least the 50% of the required distance. And then there's the requirements for the wall. So if you've just got one big wall, that's great. But the regulations do allow or do specify that the part of the wall that is in line of sight from the protected place to the LPG tank, as marked by those green, blue lines there, that part of the wall must be at least 180-minute fire resistance rated, 3 hours fire rated. This is a change from what the regulations said previously. So the regulations previously said this had to be a 4-hour fire rated wall. And what was discovered that a lot of walls that had been previously constructed didn't meet 4 hours, but they would meet 3 hours. If you don't have documentation that shows the fire rating of the wall, but you can demonstrate that it's at least 140 millimetres thick and it's made of reinforced or solid fill concrete, then that is also an acceptable standard for that wall. It must also be vapor tight and the right height with the same parameters before. And then the rest of the wall must be either that 3-hour fire rated or be of fire resisting materials, vapor tight to the right height. And the distance around the wall horizontally from the tank to the protected place must be at least that 8 metres distance, as shown by that green arrow there. And there will be so many different scenarios that people can imagine for how this would work with their site. This is one example. If we take this site, we put the two together, then we've got a wall at one side for the public place, we've got a wall protecting the on-site protected place. What we would do in practice, no doubt, is actually have one wall that goes this way. And this is permitted. The reduced separation distance for the LPG tank can be applied to one or to two adjacent sides. So if you were trying to protect a tank on two opposite sides, that wouldn't work. The reduction in separation distance is only on one or two adjacent sides. And that seems much easier now than going through and trying to figure out what all these regulations meant. It's one of the things that does my head in, but I think I've got it all under control now. So one of the other significant changes is around packaged class 6 and 8 toxic substances. So these had new controls brought in 2017, and they require location compliance certification. So there've been some changes around the separation requirements for on-site protected places for toxic and corrosive substances. So these are new regulations that have been added in. And what this is looking at is on-site protected places that are an integral part of the storage and handling of the toxic or corrosive substances. And it allows for alternative measures to be put into place with different minimum separation distances that are determined by WorkSafe. And so the process that we'd look at here is the PCBU has got some toxic or corrosive substances on site, and they've got an on-site protected place that's too close given the distance that's required. So the PCBU needs to think about what alternative control measures they can have in place, they can institute for this. The PCBU needs to engage their compliance certifier to prepare a report around this. And the compliance certifier needs to come and inspect the site and prepare their report. And I'll have a look a bit more about what's needed there. The PCBU will then apply to WorkSafe for this determination. And WorkSafe will consider the application in regard to some very specific matters that are detailed in a new regulation. And then WorkSafe will make that determination. You'll get something nice that says you can have this reduced distance if these things are done. So the role of the compliance certifier is that they must go and inspect the site. The PCBU will provide them all the relevant information, and so the certifier will consider all this. And the report that the compliance certifier needs to prepare to support the application must detail what the location and operation of the protected places are, so what's actually happening at them, how appropriate the proposed alternative controls might be, and the extent to which the minimum separation distance may be reduced. We don't have all the answers right away. We're going to get more guidance and discussion around what's involved in this, but it's certainly adding in this process here. When WorkSafe is considering the application, there's a new regulation and it says they must consider the compliance certifier's report, what the hazards and risks from the hazardous substance are, in particular due to the proximity of the substances to where people are working. They'll consider the number of workers, what the workers are doing, where the workers are, what training the workers have had. They'll look at the effectiveness of the controls. They'll look at what fire protection measures are in place, including fire ratings of any walls and stores and doors and things. They will look at what the emergency equipment, facilities and procedures on site are like, what the required or the provisions for safe evacuation of people are, and anything else that gets introduced by a safe work instrument. There will be a form WorkSafe are putting together. Last time I checked, it hasn't been released yet, but there'll certainly be a form to go together with this application here. So what this will mean is that there's a process to reduce the separation to on-site protected places, which brings back some of the alignment with the Australian standard that the regulations were sort of based on, but WorkSafe are involved in this. There have also been some changes around tanks of class 6 and 8 substances and the separation distance for these. So for class 6 tanks and the separation distances from protected and public places, the previous regulations before they were amended referred to the same distances that are in place for packaged substances. The amendment now refers out to the separation distance provisions in the Australia New Zealand Standard 4452, storage and handling of toxic substances. And it also makes clear that if it's a 6.1D substance that's not flammable, a separation distance might be stated in a safe work instrument. There haven't been any yet, but there is provision for that. So the requirements of the Australian New Zealand Standard is for looking at the separation from protected and public places, and those are in Clause 191. That separation distance can be measured around an intervening screen wall. It needs to be 2-hour fire resistant rated. When looking at the required separation distances in the standard, you look at the quantity and the hazard of your substance and you get a distance, and that's then modified by risk and protection factors. So for example, if we had a 10,000 litre tank of a 6.1B toxic substance, that would be a class 6 packing group 2, that would require a 10 metre separation distance. It would be multiplied by 1 for being a bulk tank or a bulk container, a factor of 1 if there's no inhalation hazard from it, a factor of 1 if it's separation from a protected place, or 0.5 if it's separation from a public place, And then there's also a factor of 0.5 for on-site protected places with appropriate risk identification, assessment and control. And that sounds very similar to what we've just looked at for package stores. But this reduction in separation distance by up to half for on-site protected places doesn't require a WorkSafe determination. It's something that the PCDU can document their risk identification and controls and say this is how they're going to manage that. It doesn't need WorkSafe's input for that to be approved. But the certifier would have to review this information when they're looking at doing the location compliance certificate or indeed the stationary container certificate for the tanks. And just looking at what those walls might involve. So if the tank is taller than your protected place, then the wall needs to be 1 metre taller than the tank. If the protected place is taller than the tank, then the wall needs to be taller than the protected place or extend over the top as a roof above it. And if your tank is inside a bund, then that separation distance is measured from the inside top of the bund, not from the tank. So that's something important to be aware of. And if you've got an intervening wall, then it's measured around that wall. Similarly, for separation for Class 8 tanks, the amendment has been the addition of the provisions of a particular section of the corrosive standard 5323, which allows for intervening screen walls to be used for the separation of tanks, corrosive tanks from protected places. So the screen walls for tanks that aren't in a building are the same as we just saw for Class 6. And if the tanks are in a building, then the building wall can be that intervening wall, but it does need to either extend 1 metre above the top of the tank or at least to the roof of the building. So you sometimes see builds where there might be a concrete tilt panel slab and then there might be sheet metal above that. As long as the concrete part of that is 1 metre above the top of the tank, then that could be counted as an intervening wall. And we're nearly there. We've got one more thing to look at. When we're looking at that 1 metre above the tank or to the roof of the building, it's whichever is the lesser. So if the roof is less than 1 metre above the top of the tank, it just needs to go to that roof height. Or indeed, if you've got a 6 metre, 8 metre high roof, but the tank's only 2 metres high, then the wall only needs to go to 3 metres there. And the last wee change I'm going to look at relates to stationary container systems that are used in horticulture or viticulture. And so this is mainly looking at diesel heaters for glass houses, but if it's an internal combustion heater with a tank that's less than 600 litres, then the bits of subpart 11 of part 17 don't apply and stationary container certification is not required. And this is just filling a gap where the main regulations say if tanks are smaller than 500 litres, then these bits don't apply. And I think there's quite a significant enough number of tanks out in horticulture or viticulture that are in that 500 to 600 litre bracket that will be in court and weren't quite attended. So that's been fixed there. And that's all the amendments that we've got. So I'll have a wee look at the questions that we've got now. So a question here, does the certified handler still apply for 6.1a and 6.1d? Absolutely, certified handlers are required for the toxic substances of 6.1a and 6.1b. The change that's been made is just around the dates that are on the certificate and sort of more from an administrative processing side of things there. Okay. So the question here around regulation 1443A, so this is the new one around applying to WorkSafe for a determination for separation from on-site protected places, and how does it affect a location which does not need a location certificate due to being a laboratory. So for those of you who aren't aware, if you are a laboratory, then there are alternative provisions in part 18 for what's needed, and that includes that location certifications not needed for those that are the laboratory, but they still do need to comply with the requirements of the various parts of the legislation. What I would expect is that the laboratory itself wouldn't have quantities of toxic or corrosive substances that exceeded the hazardous substance location threshold. A store associated with a laboratory might, but there's been strong guidance there that the stores are not a laboratory. So if you've got a laboratory, you've got an external store, that store is not counted as part of the laboratory, and it needs to have a location certificate, and indeed a certified handler who can be responsible for the storage of those there. So I think that would be the situation there. But if you want to drop me an email there, Vaughan, we can just look at what your particular situation is. And a question there from Gemma: how long does the PCBU have to implement these changes? There's not a defined implementation period. The main purpose of these regulations is to fix problems that were in place. So what it is you've got a whole lot of situations that weren't compliant under the old regulations, and these now give a means of compliance. As soon as practicable to work on getting these corrections in place. But if there's something specific for your location that you're wanting to sort out how to comply with, do let me know, and we can have a chat about that. WorkSafe put out a few guidance documents over the last couple of years. The amendments have been in the wings. They came out for consultation a couple of years ago, but they certainly put out guidance around LPG tanks and separation distances and class 6 and 8 substances, particularly about what you could do if you were compliant for everything apart from your separation distance, and what their approach to compliance around those were. So hopefully a lot of the changes that have been made have been to make, particularly the LPG tanks, to make situations that are already in place compliant. But if you're looking at the process to applying for a determination, just get onto that, start talking to your certifier about that and about what's needed. It's a new process for WorkSafe as well. And do we have any other questions? Your brain was probably a bit like this when it came to starting to look at these, or perhaps if it wasn't, you hadn't looked closely enough. So I hope we've got to a situation that's a bit clearer about what these changes actually mean for us. So as I said earlier, the webinar will be available for viewing at your leisure after this session, and an email will be sent out with a link to that, and also details of any of our upcoming webinars. Thanks very much, everyone.